All right, hello everyone. Welcome to part 4 of the Thanksgiving lectures. We're taking a look at the reasons why the Pilgrims left England first in 1607. Then they left Holland in 1620 for America. Why did they do so? What you hear all the time? They left for religious freedom. Well, what was the persecution that was happening in England? We're going to take a look at that in this video. If you haven't seen part 3, you need to do so. Take a look at the early years of the English Reformation. King Henry VIII had made the break with Rome in the early 1530s, but when it came to Roman Catholic creeds and customs and ceremonies and liturgies and all the rest, Henry, for the most part, left it alone with a few minor tweaks here and there. Many of the Protestants who lived in England, who more and more gravitated toward Calvinist ideas. Calvin publishes his Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. Many of the Calvinists deeply desired further reform, or just really genuine reform, other than just replacing the Pope with the King. They get that, or begin to get it, under King Edward VI, the son of King Henry VIII. In 1547, King Edward VI surrounded himself with Calvinist Protestants. Many reforms were instituted. I detail those in a prior video. But his reign lasted only for 6 years, and then Queen Mary came to the throne, a devout Catholic, and for a 5-year period, arrest. Approximately 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. About 800 Protestants fled England into exile on the continent. Keep in mind, we have the historical hindsight of knowing that this tyrannical reign lasted only 5 years, but Protestants in England did not know that. When Mary dies in 1558, she was only 42 years old. I mean, as far as they were concerned, she was going to be on the throne for at least a couple decades. And they prepared themselves to, this is going to be a rough time up ahead, okay? But she passed away in 1558, and she is succeeded by her half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, in 1558, a Protestant, Queen Elizabeth. And so the big question looming all over the Protestant world at the time is how will Elizabeth govern, oversee the Church of England? It's clear she's going to restore the Protestant Church of England, but what will that church look like? Well, in 1558, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. This act restored the Protestant Church, named the English monarch, Queen Elizabeth, to be Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Slightly altered title from Henry's Supreme Head, now Supreme Governor. It was tax supported, of course. All office holders, whether in government or certainly within the church, had to swear an oath of allegiance to Elizabeth as Supreme Governor of the Church. All university students had to swear that oath of allegiance as well. So if you wanted to attend the University of Oxford, for example, you had to swear this oath of allegiance. And then a few months later, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity. And according to this act, all weekly Anglican church services were now required to attend. You're now all subjects required to attend Anglican church services, and if you miss a church service, you were fined a shilling for each absence. And if a shilling doesn't sound like a lot of money to you, it represented about 3 days of wages for a common worker. So about 3 days' wages for a common worker, and that's each absence. So you got 52 Sundays in a year. That adds up, okay? It's prohibitive. So required attendance. Not only that, a prohibition on any church services outside the Church of England. So if you wanted to hold alternative church services, if you wanted alternative churches, not allowed, illegal. And the punishment was strict. Imprisonment and very, very heavy fines for conducting illegal services. The Act of Parliament established an episcopal form of church government, and this was inherited from Henry VIII as well. An episcopal form of church government is a top-down form of church government, wherein in the case of Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, but here the monarch appoints the officers within the church. So the monarch in the Church of England appoints the 2 archbishops, or the senior bishops in the church, but the monarch also appoints 26 bishops underneath them. And then further down the hierarchy, all the parish clergymen, which amounted to about 8,000 clergy during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth has a challenge here. Many of these bishops, not a majority, but many of the bishops, were heavily influenced by Calvin's ideas. Many of the clergy were heavily influenced by Calvinist ideas. And while they're not a majority, they make up a significant chunk of the clergy within the Church of England. And many of these clergy and some of these bishops want further reform of the Church of England and champion further reform of that Church of England. The main question that Elizabeth has to wrestle with here is how to reconcile the more traditionalist Catholic elements that were still within the Church of England structure, in its worship, in its style, in its governance, how to reconcile that with the more reformed Calvinistic thought that was also very prominent within the church. And this is a really tricky question for Elizabeth. You had tension with regard to style and with regard to worship. You had tension between what's called high church, which is a very formal liturgy, a lot of ritual, ceremony, on the one hand, and then low church, very simple service, less emphasis or no emphasis at all on ritual. So there's a tension between high church and low church within the Church of England. You have tension on matters of doctrine. Now, the Church of England, Edward VI established this and Elizabeth continued it. In matters of doctrine, the Church of England was fairly Calvinistic, affirmed predestination and all the rest. So it's Calvinist in theological matters and doctrinal matters, but in its style and its worship, it was still retained some of those Catholic elements, and it's Episcopal in structure. And so how do you reconcile those two? That's the challenge of the Elizabethan religious settlement. Elizabeth herself was private in her quite private in her religious convictions. Nevertheless, she was a sincere Protestant, a moderate Protestant, but sincerely Protestant. She was not a closet Catholic. She was a fan of ceremony, however. She liked some of the high church elements. And she surrounded herself with other moderate Protestants. Pictured here is her chief advisor, Sir William Cecil. Cecil was a moderate Protestant. Also, importantly, Elizabeth desired stability. She wanted unity across the realm in matters of religion. She wanted to destroy the religious division that characterized so much of the 16th century in England. And so consequently, Elizabeth was actually quite tolerant of Catholics. So long as those Catholics outwardly conformed to the Church of England, you weren't allowed to establish your own secret, unlawful Catholic churches. Don't do that, okay? Or Elizabeth will come down hard on you. But you could outwardly conform to the Church of England. Inwardly, you're really Catholic, but you don't ruffle too many feathers. Elizabeth's okay with that. She's not going to harass you, okay? Elizabeth, in pursuing this unity and trying to end religious divisions, wanted the Church of England to be a fairly broad tent with some Calvinistic elements and some traditional high church elements all combined into this broad tent Church of England. And for that reason, from the 1560s onward, Elizabeth resisted, or just flat out blocked, all calls for further reform of the Church of England. She was an ambitious monarch. This was a very optimistic time for the realm. This is when you had a lot of the Elizabethan explorers, and Sir Francis Drake was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. That happened under Elizabeth. The first attempt at colonization in America happened under Elizabeth. She's one of the greatest monarchs in English history. There's no dispute there. Again, she wants this religious unity. A bit naively, she thinks that she can end those religious divisions. But this her blocking of further reform ends up creating a splinter group within the Church of England. They remain within the church, or most of them do. There's an exception. I'll look at them later. They remain within the church, but they want to reform it. They are not satisfied with the current structure, with the current state of the Church of England. And these people, of course, were known as Puritans. The name Puritan, by the way, began as an epithet. Okay, but it was eventually embraced. And these were people who wanted to purify the church, to purge the church of all remaining Catholic elements, to de-Catholicize the church. The Puritans were extremely zealous in their Calvinism. One Puritan around this time described the Anglican Church as a, quote, mingle-mangle between Protestantism and Catholicism. And as already noted, Puritanism became prominent within not just the laity, but also within many of the clergy. Many of the clergy were on board with the Puritan program of attempting to further reform the church. They were influenced by Calvin, again, as I noted. And in fact, actually, the first English translation of Calvin's famous Institutes was published in 1561. Before it, if you wanted to read Calvin's Institutes, you had to know Latin, which was good for scholars, but for everyone else, not possible. And now it's in the English tongue. And so that further spread Calvinist ideas among the wider public. And then also, very importantly, in 1560, the Geneva Bible was published, an English translation of the Bible. It was first published in Europe. It was imported into England. And it is, the first mass-produced English translation of the Bible. It was commonly used by lay people. It was sold cheaply, had small editions and large editions, but the small editions came at a low price. It was called the Geneva Bible because the Protestant scholars who worked on it in the 1550s were exiles during the reign of Queen Mary, and they were in Geneva, and that's when they put this Bible together. John Knox, by the way, was one of those scholars who worked on that Bible. But I've got a copy right here of the Geneva Bible. This is a 1599 edition, but it wasn't just a translation, it included marginal notes, and a lot of marginal notes, by the way, and annotations. You can see some of the notes there on the bottom, if the camera can catch it. About 300,000 words worth of just notes explaining and interpreting the text. It included sample prayers, cross-references. It was a very, very popular Bible. By the way, this is the Bible that the Pilgrims brought on the Mayflower. It was the favorite Bible of Puritans all the way up through the 17th century. When King Henry VIII, 20 years earlier, had authorized an English translation of the Bible called the Great Bible. Notice King Henry VIII on the cover there of the Great Bible. It was a pulpit Bible. It wasn't in people's homes. Okay, it was in the pulpits, and that was it. This was in people's homes. People read it. People studied it. And the ruling authorities within the Church of England did not like this Bible. They did not like this Bible for numerous reasons. It wasn't officially authorized. So that's a good picture there. You see a map. Okay, it's a great Bible. And in reply, in 1568, Elizabeth commissioned an official authorized English translation of the Bible called the Bishop's Bible. But it didn't take off. It was not popular. It was an inferior translation. And then later, King James in 1611 had the King James Version published. But even after a King James Version in 1611, a Geneva Bible was the favorite of Puritans. And so Bible reading took off. And you can't overstate the importance of that. Bible reading was not done by the wider public prior to the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible revolutionizes the laity, the wider public, and they're reading the Bible, many of them for the very first time. Now, let me be clear. Again, there were conforming Puritans within the church who were bishops and clergy. There were also conforming Puritans who were close to the court of Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth, yes, she surrounds herself with many high church, moderate Protestants, but there are conforming Puritans within her circle. And they have some influence, but she resists. She resists. And a conforming Puritan, and by conforming Puritan, I just mean a Puritan who stays within the Church of England. They don't establish their own unlawful, separate congregations. They stay within the church and hope to reform the church from the inside. The Reforming Puritan had to walk a very thin line. It was it's tricky business being a conforming Puritan during this period, because who's the supreme governor of the Church of England? The monarch. Well, if you're excessively critical of the Church of England, that can be interpreted as treasonous, as seditious. Okay, Elizabeth will tolerate some, moderate calls for reform, and that's okay. But you get too radical, you get too excessive in your demands for reform. Now there's questions of loyalty. Okay, the first big controversy to blow up between the Puritans and the Church of England, leaders within the Church of England, was the vestments controversy. The clergy within the Church of England wore traditional vestments or liturgical garments, including the clerical cap and some of the robes. Puritans were very critical of these garments. They called them vain and superstitious. Puritans advocated a far more simple clergy with just humble, simple black gowns. That was a big controversy in the 1560s, eventually died down. From the 1570s onward, the big conflict was over matters of church government. A lot of Puritans, perhaps all Puritans, opposed the episcopal top-down form of church government where the monarch appointed everyone, and wanted either a congregational form of church government where each congregation appointed their own ministers, or the vast majority of the Puritans desired a Presbyterian form of government, as John Knox had established in Scotland, whereby each congregation elects representatives called elders, and then these elders, elected by the congregation, meet in presbyteries and decide on church matters, sort of a combination of bottom-up and top-down from the presbyteries. The Greek word in the New Testament for elder is presbyter, so that's where that comes from. So that was it. This matter of church government was a big controversy early on. Some other controversies between the Puritans and the official Church of England. Puritans generally opposed organ music in church. See some organs there. Puritans preferred, some Puritans just outright opposed hymns. They didn't want hymns. They believed that you should only sing from from the Psalter. You should only sing psalms. This was Calvin's policy in Geneva. They only sang from the Psalms. Puritans oppose, just a list here, wedding rings. They favored the word minister over priest. They opposed making the sign of the cross in baptism and communion. They opposed the ritual of bowing at the mention of the name of Jesus. They opposed the reading of the books of the Apocrypha. Many Puritans opposed use of the Book of Common Prayer in the liturgy. They thought the Book of Common Prayer was, while Protestant, had too many Catholic elements about it. Puritans preferred simple services. That included prayer, singing of psalms, and preaching. They were advocates of just, again, a very humble, unceremonious service. In a private home, they were big advocates of private Bible reading, private Bible study, the study of learned Calvinist theologians. So there's read Calvin's Institutes, prayer groups. They didn't like the formulaic prayers that you saw in some of the liturgy. They believed that many of them, not all of them, but many of them believed that church membership should be limited only to those who had shown outwardly an outward sign of true conversion. Puritans called these the visible saints, as opposed to the invisible saints, who are the truly converted church. But since we can't see inside of someone's heart, we can't know inwardly if they are truly converted. The only thing we can go by is the outward sign. And so only those who show an outward sign of true conversion, only they should be allowed church membership. The problem was that Church of England required everyone to belong to the Church of England. And so by consequence, Christians, truly converted Christians, had to share pews with false believers. Puritans came from all ranks of society. Some of them were well-to-do. A very few of them were aristocrats. They tended to concentrate in cities like London or East Anglia or Sussex, especially in the southeast of England. There was a lot of Puritan activity there. London, by this point in time, was a very large city, probably about 150,000 people, maybe as many as 200,000 people. At the time in London, there was a lot of crime, drunkenness, debauchery, and Puritans believed that these problems were caused in part by bad religion, and that a truly Reformed church, a true Reformation in England, would lead to a moral revolution. Most Puritans were middling, on a middling part of the class spectrum. They were property holders, but not substantial property holders, but respectable property holders. Middling farmers, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, all were included in the ranks of the Puritans. Now, it's important to emphasize most English people were completely fine with the Church of England as it currently stood. Most English people were completely okay with the Elizabethan settlement. A lot of critics charged Puritans of obsessing over matters that were not essential to the faith, that they were just divisive, and Elizabeth herself looked at the Puritans and was just frustrated that they were continually poking at creating all these disputes as she saw it. In addition, while Elizabeth had Puritans around her, conforming Puritans, there was something alarming about Puritanism. Monarchs, and especially Queen Elizabeth, again, she wanted a united realm, she wanted a quiet realm, and she wanted unquestioning loyalty. And she's understood, and monarchs that followed her understood that there was a subversive element within Puritanism, even among conforming Puritanism, but especially among nonconforming Puritanism. And that leads us to our next and final section, Separatists. Now, a nonconformist could be anybody who objected belonging to the Church of England. So you could have nonconformists who were Roman Catholics. You could have nonconformists who were, deists, or nonconformists who rejected the Trinity. It was all across the board. But here we have nonconformist Puritans who were Calvinists, they were Orthodox, and all in all those matters. But they had come around to conclude that there was no way to reconcile their differences with the Church of England. And so they established, secretly, unlawfully, their own independent congregations. This began as early as the 1560s, when it became clear that Elizabeth is not reforming the church any further. Many a group of people, nonconformist Puritans, began establishing these separatist congregations. Members of the separatist movement were routinely arrested. Small number of them were executed. There weren't mass executions like under Mary. I think in Queen Elizabeth's 45-year reign, there were only 9 radical Protestants who were executed. But still, the hotbed for separatist activity was in London. It's called the London Underground Church. Numbered approximately 1,000 people, which is a decent number. Okay, now that's a little less than 1% of the total population in London, but still 1,000 people, and the locations are spread out throughout the city. Again, it's all unlawfully and all in secret. They were sometimes referred to as Brownist, because one of the early leaders of the separatist movement was a man named Robert Brown, even though Brown later returned to the Anglican Church in the 1590s. Members of the London Underground Church, again, routinely arrested. Several dozen members of the London Underground Church would be held at a single time in England. And then in 1593, 2 leaders of the London Underground Church, John Greenwood, pictured here on this stained glass of what today is a Reformed church, John Greenwood and Henry Barrow. John Greenwood and Henry Barrow, who were leaders of the London Underground Church, they had been arrested multiple times. And then finally in 1593, Elizabeth had them hanged. Immediately after, a group of London separatists fled England and emigrated to Amsterdam. In Holland at the time, which was the predominant faith in Holland, was Calvinist Reformed. In Holland at the time, there was broad religious freedom, especially if you were a Protestant. But even if you were Jewish and Catholics, not so much. But if you were Protestant, there was wide toleration for your right to worship. And so Holland attracted some of these English separatists in the 1590s in order to escape further persecution. There's Amsterdam in the late 16th century, early 17th century. Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603 and is replaced by the King of Scotland, James. In Scotland, he was known as King James VI. In England, he was King James I. James had been King of Scotland since he was 1 year old in 1567. Now, a lot of Puritans were very hopeful at the outset of James's reign. Scotland, after all, was heavily Calvinist. Scotland had a Presbyterian mode of church governance. So this sounded good. James was very public in his views that he was a Protestant, he's a Calvinist. But what they didn't quite appreciate was that James did not like the Presbyterian form of government in Scotland and believed that the monarchy in Scotland did not have enough control over ecclesiastical matters there. James was a champion of a political theory called divine right of kings, which was an absolutist theory of government, who said that the king has the regal prerogative to impose laws, doesn't need a parliament at all, or if there is a parliament, you try to minimize to the best you can ever having to call that parliament. And James believed that an independent church would promote subversion from the monarchy. James did not have much tolerance for Puritans who were too insistent on reform, because as far as he was concerned, if the king's subjects, if his subjects could defy him as their religious leader, well, maybe they could defy him as their political leader. And so despite initial hopes that further reform would occur, it did not. And in fact, actually, in the early years of his reign, there were arrests. Several of the more radical Puritan ministers were suspended or even fired. He was just very clear: no more reform, especially in church governance. Well, if he was not very tolerant of conforming Puritanism, what do you think he made of nonconforming Puritanism? What about separatism? And of course, here, King James could not have any tolerance. By the way, you'll find this interesting. I mentioned in 1611, James authorized the King James version of the Bible. He opposed the Geneva Bible, not because of its translation, not because of the translation of the text, but primarily for the notes that were in this Bible. James described the notes of the Geneva Bible as, quote, very partial, untrue, seditious, and savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. Okay, so he believed that the Geneva Bible promoted republicanism, and he objected to a few of the notes in the Geneva Bible that described certain monarchs in biblical history as tyrants. And so James authorizes King James Version of the Bible, and the King James Version of the Bible, an excellent Bible, by the way, just brilliant. The majesty of the King James Bible is second to none, but it didn't include any notes, okay? So, but anyway, that's where King James is coming from. Well, in 1606, a Separatist congregation formed in a village called Scrooby. And Scrooby is in the East Midlands, right here. And they met in the home of this man, William Brewster. Manor. It's quite a sizable home. It wasn't a large congregation. The name of their pastor was John Robinson. The congregation just numbered about 50 people. In 1607, several members of the congregation were arrested, fined. Some of them were imprisoned. The Separatists were very aware of what members of the London Underground Church had done in the 1590s. They had gone to Amsterdam. And since the 1590s, they had worshipped freely in Amsterdam. And so in 1607, the Scrooby congregation, after a few bungled attempts, and that's a different story, the Scrooby congregation unlawfully fled England for Holland. They went first to Amsterdam, but within 2 years in 1609, they had moved their church to Leiden. It was at Leiden that the Separatist congregation resided for a little more than a decade. And then in 1620, they boarded the Mayflower and came to America. Okay, so that's all for part 4. For part 5, we'll take a look at the Pilgrims, their voyage to America, that deadly, harsh winter, the bountiful harvest, and that Thanksgiving feast in October of 1621. Looking forward to seeing you there. So long.